Good afternoon to everybody who's in Europe, and good morning to all of you who are in the States. Thank you very much for joining us on this second session of our annual conference. This is the 19th edition of IFRI's annual event on all things US. Yesterday, we talked about US politics in the 1 month after the election. And today we are going to discuss US foreign policy, what has happened in the 4 years that just passed, what is bound to happen with the Biden administration. We are joined by 5 excellent people today. I'm not sure I'm going to read out all their credentials because you have all received a PDF document with the biographies of everyone. So let's listen to them instead of talk about them. I will start with our very distinguished keynote, Walter Russell Mead, who has very kindly agreed to give us a presentation to start off. You probably have heard of Walter Mead because he wrote this very famous book, maybe almost 20 years ago now, giving a typology of US foreign policy according to 4 presidents and 1 secretary of the Treasury, I think, Hamilton. So Walter Mead proposes to divide the types of foreign policy that the US conduct through the ages according to 4 traditions. The Jacksonian tradition, the Hamiltonian one, the Wilsonian one, and the last one is, I should have written them down because usually I roll them off like this. The last one is the Jeffersonian tradition. Am I right?
Very good, very good.
Well, thank you. Okay, so I wanted you to tell us whether you think that typology has remained correct, or if you think or even has been reinforced by the Trump presidency, or if you think you should adapt what you had described at the time, question 1, and then what you think the Biden administration is going to be, and whether, again, it will adapt to one of your 4 types. So I give you the floor for maybe 10, 15 minutes, then we can have questions, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panel with the 4 other speakers. One important thing I want to tell everyone who's listening to this conference, please ask questions using the tab that says chat at the bottom of your screen. And along the way, I will ask your questions to our speakers. But now I will shut down my microphone and give the floor to Professor Walter Mead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laurence. And it is great, even virtually, to be with IFRI today. I only wish I were there in Paris with you, actually, but perhaps next year. IFRI consistently produces some of the most interesting and important panels on international affairs. So I congratulate you for the work, and I'm very happy to be part of it today. Look, I think these typologies have been relevant for a long time. I think they're going to continue to be. I'm quite sure that the portrait of Andrew Jackson, which Donald Trump installed in the Oval Office of the White House at the suggestion of Steve Bannon, will be removed very early in the Biden administration. My guess would be on January 20th, if not in the redecoration before. And while he will probably not choose a presidential portrait based on special providence, if he did, I think you would see the portraits of Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Jefferson staring at each other somewhat dourly across his office. And we will talk about that a bit later. But if we look forward to the Biden administration, I think the first thing to understand about this is that it will be a Biden administration in foreign policy. He is the most seasoned and experienced incoming president that we've had since Dwight Eisenhower. This is that not only was he like Nixon was for 8 years vice president and handling a number of foreign issues then. But he has been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, long-term member of that committee. And if you were to ask President-elect Biden what he thinks are his core skills that he brings to the office, one of them would be, in his view, his foreign policy experience and background. So he is not, and if we look at the people that he has selected to work with him, they are close and trusted aides who he knows well, whose instincts he trusts, whose views he thinks are aligned with his own. This is not a president who is trying to hire someone to tell him what to do. This is not, he's not looking to hire experts. He is an expert. And the people around him are people who are used to advising and working with him. And I think this may be a bit underestimated by people who sort of think, well, he's, Joe Biden, what do we really know about him? Who is he? He will be his own man in foreign affairs. What can we understand from that? I think the first thing we need to understand is just generational and chronological. He will likely be the last American president whose ideas of the world were formed under the Cold War and pre-9/11. He comes into office with deeply rooted assumptions about what's important, how things work, where history is headed, and what the United States can and should accomplish. And they track, by and large, they track the kind of conventional Democratic Party policy, foreign policy wisdom of the 1980s and 1990s. That is, that's a complex legacy. It's not a simple one, but we need to understand that Biden is a man formed by the 20th century who will be seeking to provide leadership in the 21st. Ideologically, I mentioned that I see him as having a foot in both the Wilson and the Jefferson camps in the special providence typology. Well, what does that mean? One thing is to contrast him with Trump. Trump was a man who I think had one foot in the Jeffersonian camp and one foot in the Jacksonian camp. That is, both Jeffersonians and Jacksonians tend to be America first in their way. And see that the nation building the United States needs to be doing is primarily at home. The Jacksonians have a much more sort of assertive vision of when should the United States be involved militarily or in other ways abroad, much quicker to respond to threats, to envision contests with others. Jeffersonians are often skeptical of international, not of diplomacy, but of binding international agreements and long-term US commitments. Jeffersonians tend to think that the United States can best preserve its democracy by reducing its commitments overseas. We could go on about this obviously a long time, and we may get to some of it in the Q&A. But the mix of Wilson and Jefferson, of trying to transform the world and build a values-based values-based order, not quite a rules-based order, a values-based order, and there's a difference, is very much a Wilsonian tradition. To put that in opposition with an instinct for withdrawal and restraint can create difficulties. And I would actually argue that both President Carter and President Obama had this mix of Jeffersonian and Wilsonian commitments. And this can often cause problems because you have at one level very advanced commitments. President-elect Biden talks about, really bending the curve on carbon, a transformation of the world approach to climate change. That's an extraordinarily ambitious goal. That is not an isolationist goal. He also talks about stressing human rights. So Erdogan must be held accountable. China must be held accountable on human rights. The Wilsonian instinct is to globalize American values and to seek to use primarily diplomatic power to advance those. But that can often get you into, but assertive visions, as Jeffersonians will be quick to remind you, assertive visions of your values can lead you into commitments. And so we saw President Obama being a bit embarrassed by the contrast between, say, his vision of reconciliation with the Arab world and democracy, and say the actual policy that the US pursued in Syria. That's a kind of a classic problem of high Wilsonian goals, but cheap Jeffersonian means. It can look awkward. Now, I think President Carter did not manage to carry this tension well. President Obama was much more successful, certainly politically. So we can't say much about whether or not Biden would succeed or fail based on this mix of approaches. But I think we can see some of the tensions that will be part of his foreign policy. And probably I should just say that one of the things that this mix often leads to is use of things like drones and special forces, because they can look to a president who has made large Wilsonian commitments like a very convenient way of exerting force. And for President Carter, the failure of the hostage rescue attempt was a sort of decisive political failure for him. While for President Obama, the successful raid on Osama bin Laden was a moment of real political triumph for President Obama. So the use of special forces as a way to achieve Wilsonian means within an overall context of attempting some kind of restraint, it's a very tempting, could almost call it a cheat for a president. Overall, I think this is a policy that's likely to be more welcomed in Berlin than in Paris. I think the Biden mix of a values-based agenda with some restraint will irritate we will continue the long American tradition of irritating the French. And the Germans, on the other hand, are likely to find this much more in line with their own thinking. A values-based policy which also stresses restraint is not a bad description of Angela Merkel's overall approach to international affairs. So we may see U.S.-German relations taking a much easier turn in this new administration. In terms of, so reassure Europe, look good on climate, put the world back to sleep. That to some degree might describe an aspect of the Biden policy that, again, from someone, for Biden, a more tranquil world is the goal. We've had too much disturbance. We want to get back to a time when geopolitical rivalries weren't on the agenda, where the front pages weren't erupting every day. A quiet, normal life abroad, a quiet, normal life at home. In some sense, that was what President-elect Biden was pitching during the election. I'll just briefly say something about the Far East and the Middle East, and then turn it over to the other panelists. Inevitably, whether we call it the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, or some other new name, the Far East and the Indian Ocean area will be central to American foreign policy under Biden. But again, Biden's objective is going to be, in a sense, to try to prevent the rise of China from interfering with the smooth working of the American-led world order, rather than look for a confrontation with China to seek some kind of resolution of issues. It's more trying to do what is needed to keep things as quiet as possible in the Far East, while one goes about the business of repairing, restoring, perhaps reforming the international order and dealing with the issues of the day as Biden sees them. So to prevent the rise of China from disrupting the consolidation of a values-based international order is probably not a bad, quick way of describing a policy that, but I should say that this then leaves a considerable amount of initiative to China. That how much China interferes or is seen to interfere with Biden's global agenda will be very interesting for the future of our relations. With India, it's just at least worth acknowledging that I think the Biden administration will have a slightly more difficult relationship with the Modi government than the Trump administration did, that the values issues will cause some tension in the bilateral relationship in ways they did not under Trump, who really was not interested to some degree for a Biden administration. Congress India is a more natural partner than BJP India, but Congress India is, I think, mostly a thing of the past. So it'll be interesting to see how the very different values perspectives in Delhi and Washington sort themselves out under a Biden administration. Finally, in the Middle East, here I think we've been actually hearing some concrete news. I think the new administration is likely to take the Abraham Accords as a gift and welcome them. Certainly the last thing President-elect Biden would want to start his administration off with would be a fight with Israel over annexations on the West Bank. That would be a difficult fight inside the Democratic Party. It'd be a difficult political issue internationally. The fact that the Abraham Accords have taken that off the table is all good from Biden's point of view. I would imagine that if the arms sales to UAE and so on go forth, are completed before the end of this administration, there won't be a lot of hunger to call them back. He'll just sort of operate from there. I think it is worth noting that U.S. influence over Israel is significantly diminished by these accords, and that the sort of flowering of this relationship, which is not a relationship of love, but is a relationship of realpolitik, and in international politics, those are often the strongest relationships, actually reduces Israel's dependence on American support and to some degree weakens the levers that the United States might try to use to affect Israeli behavior on things like settlements. So we'll see how that works out in practice. Obviously, the JCPOA in Iran is the big black box. Again, I think what Iran decides is going to have a lot more to do with where the Biden administration goes, whether Iran is willing to re-engage on the original terms. It's clear that Biden cannot bind his successor. So what is Iran prepared to give for an agreement that can't be ratified by the Senate and maybe overturned in some ways? What's the Iranian argument either way for how do you handle that? That's likely to be a bigger driver of U.S.-Iran policy than any position papers that are written during the transition. So those are just some overall thoughts, Laurence. I hope they are helpful. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing comments and questions and conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, very interesting. I think Kristin Diwan will be happy to comment on your last points on the Middle East. There's only one little question in the feed, and I'll add one if you allow me. The question that I read is whether Kamala Harris will have any say in Biden's foreign policy. It doesn't look like it, but maybe you have other information. My question is on trade policy. You haven't mentioned Hamilton in reference to Trump's mercantilist trade policy these past 4 years. And we've all heard that President Biden has made noises during the campaign that he wouldn't go back to free trade as usual. He would be more Trumpian in a way on that. So do you agree? Is that how you read things?
Well, I think, I always thought that the way to revive the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, would be to add another T, the Trump Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that, rebranding, as we saw with NAFTA, has turned out to be a rather effective political strategy. So I think certainly the Biden administration is going to explore the possibility of rebranding some of these agreements and initiatives. It is worth, and from the Democratic Party side, some kind of free trade agreement with Europe would be much easier to reach than a free trade agreement with Asia, because the labor standards and environmental standards would be much easier to incorporate into a transatlantic agreement. So I could imagine them pushing for free trade with Europe in order to show their free trade credentials, but having more difficulty reaching something in Asia. I don't know. Again, that's possibly a way in which they would irritate the French and please the Germans to some degree. Just quickly on the vice president-elect, at this point, I do not see a large role for her in international politics. Who knows how that will work out? And the fact that Susan Rice has been named as the domestic policy senior advisor suggests that we may be seeing a less powerful vice president. Early to say, but in the, up until really Al Gore's vice presidency, the vice presidency was almost a useless organ in the American government. And we've had Al Gore, we've had Dick Cheney, we've had Joe Biden, and even Mike Pence have all been much more consequential. I think when Nixon was running for office for president in 1960, someone asked Dwight Eisenhower, what important decisions Nixon had helped with in the White House, journalists. And Eisenhower said something like, well, let me think for a week and I'll try to get back to you. That's much closer to the historic view of the vice presidency. Now, the job of president has grown so much, there's just a lot of work in the White House. So I don't think the vice president-elect is going to be irrelevant in quite that way. But I do see very, very powerful people reporting directly to the president installed in these key places.
Okay, thank you. I think we will pass the floor to Professor Wertheim, who is a co-founder of the Quincy Institute, so yet another president. And I do believe that, again, they take that president's record in foreign affairs to be a model that they suggest America should follow. Professor Wertheim, you're on.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with IFRI and to offer a few riffs on Walter Russell Mead's very compelling remarks. I would say that his typologies have only gained in salience over the past 4 years of a largely Jacksonian president. I think one of the reasons they work so well is precisely that they represent ideational tendencies that can be mapped onto almost any grand strategy that the US might pursue and a variety of domestic political realities. My own inclination then is to emphasize some of those strategic and political realities that I think the Biden administration will be facing. So let me make a few remarks in that vein. To me, Biden enters office facing a rather profound crisis of America's role in the world, and one that some members of his team might recognize, others might not. That is a strategic crisis in which the United States is overstretched and in terms of its military engagements and commitments, and has been engaging for quite some time in a indiscriminate kind of foreign policy, which I think many recognize the Trump administration took to new heights, but in my view, the administration merely intensified some existing trends. There's also, I think, a legitimacy crisis. the American public seems to be looking for something different on foreign affairs. This notion of endless war has become one of the main ways in which Americans object to their foreign policy, which is a historically quite unusual thing. I hate to use the overused word unprecedented, but for Americans in large numbers on left and right to be expressing that the problem they see with their country's foreign policy is that the country is waging warfare continually and without adequate justification is something quite remarkable. And if you scratch the surface, I think a lot of experts, a lot of elites in the United States are also increasingly unsure about America's place in the world. Why is the United States undertaking the policies it is? They've spent a period of time now kind of warning about the collapse of democracy, or at least the fragility of democracy in the United States, even as they wrestle with how to implement US leadership in the world. So I think there's this kind of dual crisis of grand strategy and political legitimacy that the Biden administration has to insert itself into. In the campaign, of course, Joe Biden ran mostly on a message of restoration, which does not suggest a willingness to take risks to try and get at the root of some of these problems. And I agree with Walter in this regard. Biden has a long experience in foreign policy. It's more extensive than any of our presidents as they came into office since George H.W. Bush. And indeed, Biden's appointments so far signal more restoration than change. These are people he's appointed who, in most cases, he's worked with personally for a long period of time, and people who have steered US foreign policy for decades. I think it's interesting that Biden's own record has received surprisingly little or surprisingly superficial scrutiny in the campaign. Because of the dynamic in the primary between Biden, the centrist, and progressives, he was, faulted over his support for the Iraq War of 2003, and thus cast as a kind of mainstream hawk. But as he tried to point out in several occasions, he has been drifting in the other direction for at least 15 years. Since he proposed his own plan to allow the United States to draw down or exit Iraq in 2006, and then from within the Obama administration, opposed the surge in Afghanistan, the intervention in Libya, and so forth. So that's interesting. And I do think Joe Biden promised some change. He promised to end America's forever wars, including by ceasing US material support for the war in Yemen. And he said that he would treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah. He said that on the debate stage. That's very interesting. And those two positions would reverse the policies of the Obama administration. And clearly the Biden administration is gearing up to undertake new measures to address climate change and pandemic disease. And it has in recent days signaled a clear intention to re-enter the nuclear agreement with Iran if that can be achieved without trying to use the Trump administration's sanctions as leverage to create a better deal in the first instance. But I think it remains to be seen whether the administration will act boldly enough to respond to changes in the world and in the United States, where the Biden administration might find itself in 4 or 8 years handing the reins of power back to another Trump or even Trump himself. I'm intrigued by Walter's suggestion that the administration intends to put the world back to sleep, which suggests an avoidance of contradictions and difficult choices. And of course, the world never sleeps. So some questions that I have for the next 4 years that perhaps can be revisited in 4 years' time. Will the administration merely reduce some troops in the Middle East and maybe proclaim that it's ended endless war? and turn the page? Or will it undertake a systematic effort to disentangle the United States from the region's political alignments and military conflicts? Will the administration talk a good game about diplomacy? Or will it make diplomacy not just the first, but also the last resort in most cases where America's vital interests are not at stake? Will the administration practice a multilateralism, as it signaled it will do, but one in which America dictates outcomes? Or will it welcome the initiative of allies like France and South Korea that want to take greater initiative to advance their conception of security in their own neighborhoods? And will the administration simply layer new initiatives on the environment and public health on top of America's pursuit of military dominance with forward deployments in essentially every region? Or will it firmly prioritize some of the shared planetary threats that its principles have talked about? So the question, in short, is, will the Biden administration truly prioritize peaceful forms of engagement over the pursuit of armed dominance? Or will it remain in the paradigm of a grand strategy of liberal hegemony and then try to layer other efforts on top of that fundamental posture? Now, you know, I think the smart money and the money that Walter has put on the table would suggest a more cautious approach, one that accepts the continued pursuit of military primacy. And so I have no disagreement there. But it's possible that in 4 years, we could look back and say that we missed some things and that things turned out differently. And if we do, I think the explanation would go something like this. First of all, that there were significant domestic pressures in American foreign policy that we haven't really seen in earnest over the last few decades that we've underrated. That would include a congressional coalition that might now include some Republicans who want to constrain the president, reclaim congressional war powers and national security powers more broadly. That would include progressives in Congress who make common cause with them, continuing a trend from the Trump years in which some progressives and conservatives teamed up to try to demand that the president stop supporting Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. It would include new forms of public pressure. Now about a quarter of Americans say that they think military interventions generally make Americans more safe, more safe, that they enhance American security. About 3/4 of the public want US troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq. These are startling numbers in a highly divided society. And if things turn out in a direction of greater restraint, then we might also attribute that to Biden himself. We'll see. But he may be more concerned about overstretch than some of his campaign remarks suggested. And it may be that domestic circumstances push the administration in a direction that they're not necessarily planning to go, but they turn out to welcome over the course of the next 4 years. So I'll go ahead and leave it there and welcome the rest of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's fascinating, very interesting, and what I appreciate very much is that you have asked questions that open the way for the 3 other panelists to take the floor now to answer them. So the way we've done it is we've chosen 3 panelists who will each talk about a specific area. Kristin Diwan will talk about the Middle East. Then we'll have Benjamin Haddad, who will talk about the transatlantic relation, Europe. And last but not least, Alex Lennon will address China policy, or the US-China policy, past and future. So, Kristin, would you like to take the floor now and tell us what you think about what Biden may do or not do in the Middle East?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And first, just let me express my appreciation to you, Laurence, and to Ifri. It's a real pleasure to be with you virtually. And as others have said, I'm looking forward to rejoining you in person in Paris when we have that opportunity. Laurence originally asked me to speak about the relations between the Gulf states in particular and the United States and how this will change under a Biden administration. And I think, you know, when we look to the Gulf states or the Middle East in general, there's plenty of fundamental changes that we can talk about, that we can see happening in this transition from Trump to Biden. But I wanted to start by underlining and highlighting a point of growing convergence, actually, or consensus in policy circles, and the approach to the Middle East that started at least under the Obama administration. And I think that's the conviction that the US has been investing too much of its diplomatic energy and military commitment in the Middle East, and that strategically there's a real need to shift the focus east and to address the main strategic challenge that the US faces, and that is China. And I think in line with that attitude that's, you know, we've been seeing across these administrations, you definitely need to take into mind as well the point made by Stephen Wertheim about the exhaustion with the Middle East and the wars and the kind of blood and treasure that's been lost in the region. And I'd say when we look at the Middle East actors generally, there's a growing realization and internalization about this, I think. We can see this, especially with our Gulf partners, understanding that the US cannot or will not secure what they see as their fundamental security interests in the region. And because of that, we've seen these states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar to some degree, and even as Walter Russell Mead mentioned, even our close partners such as Israel, really moving to explore or deepen partnerships with other states and to build up their own capacity. And so we're really not anymore in this era where we could talk about, you know, during the Cold War, a US security umbrella over these sort of more passive dependent states. We now see much more direct Gulf intervention, especially as we see this collapse of a ring of states in the Arab region and increasing competition, of course, to determine the emerging order in this kind of era of disorder, I guess you could say. And we have seen the Gulf states, you know, once what we saw, these more passive states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and to some extent Qatar, being very actively engaged in this competition, right alongside other important regional powers such as Iran and Turkey. So in short, I mean, we see them working to diversify security relationships and demonstrating a willingness to use force directly to achieve their objectives. So when the Biden administration comes in and surveys this sort of changed landscape, you know, and wants to do more with less, I think there's, you know, first question is to ask, what are the priorities going to be then in terms of fundamental, you know, determining fundamental US security? And then the second question is going to be, how do you deal with these partners then that are taking this much more active role? Presumably is we're going to be expecting them to share more of the burden of securing the region. So I think to the first question, I think to that extent, when we look at priorities, we are going to see a little bit of a return to the Obama administration approach. And we see a lot of the former officials in the Obama administration coming back and people who have a lot of experience in this. And I can talk about where it's different, but I do think that Biden, like the President Obama, see addressing their issue as a relational issue and securing our interests in the region and preventing the kind of proliferation that would be a broader threat to the whole global order and not just the Middle East. And I think there's another reason why we can expect that this is going to be the top kind of policy agenda for the Biden administration. And that kind of speaks to these sort of values-based shifts that Walter Russell Mead spoke of earlier. And I think for the Biden administration, this really strong commitment to multilateralism and the desire, especially to rebuild this strong transatlantic alliance with our partners, with our European partners in particular, is really a big motivation to the overall policy that the Biden administration has. And they really want to make and draw contrast with what was happening under the Trump administration on these issues. And I think it's even more than an instrumental posture, though I think, it is that. It is going to functionally matter in how they're going to draw upon these institutions, international institutions, and multilateralism. But it's also a much more value-based issue that they see the importance of reestablishing these links with these democratic partners. And so I think that makes the return to the JCPOA and its multilateral framework of even broader significance, perhaps even beyond just the Middle East, where it obviously has huge significance there. I think this will be a big debate in Washington. It's already a big debate in Washington by those who do not want to see the Biden administration lose or waste the leverage that has already been gained by the Trump administration over Iran through its kind of unprecedented and quite effective, actually, use of sanctions, economic sanctions. And of course, that same debate that's taking place in the US has been taken up by the Gulf states themselves, including most recently just at the Manama dialogue taking place in Bahrain, where the Gulf states were really setting out a number of markers regarding the necessity that they be consulted in these issues, and more than that, that they be made part of the process, and really making their case for the primacy of dealing with Iran, not just in the nuclear issue, but in terms of missiles and missile proliferation, and the malign intervention that they see of Iran taking place across the region in a number of different settings. So I think when we look at the Biden administration, they've acknowledged this. They've voiced their intent to include the Gulf states in their concerns in a way that wasn't done, perhaps with the Obama administration. But I think there will still be a big battle over sequencing and how they actually do this. In recent interviews, both President-elect Biden and his appointed National Security Council head, Jake Sullivan, have expressed a desire to move quickly in rejoining the JCPOA. And, and then kind of looking at perhaps a framework, establishing a framework where they would be able to include these other states in these discussions over regional issues. But I think, that is going to be a really big debate. And I don't think we know exactly how that's going to play out until we start to see more of the principals even be appointed on this issue and see how that argument sort of plays out in Washington. But that's definitely one that we can look at ahead. The second big issue then would be how the Biden administration plans to deal with these regional partners. And particularly, if we're going to rely upon them more, how do we deal with these when their own independent actions work against what we see as our interests or our values? And we could bring values elements in here. And here, I think the really big issue, which was alluded to before as well, is going to be how do we deal with Saudi Arabia? And I think the Saudi relationship specifically will be an issue, of course, because of some of the actions that Saudi Arabia itself has taken. We've seen the Yemen war be a real problem. Obviously, it's a disaster in Yemen itself, but also an issue that's been taken up with some vigor in Congress because of the humanitarian suffering there. We've also seen Saudi Arabia take actions actually beyond its borders to silence political opponents. And here we could speak, of course, of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but also other actions to intervene against critics abroad, as well as a persistent campaign against women activists at home. And I think it's also going to be hard to ignore because Saudi Arabia has become a more partisan issue under the Trump administration, in part because of the more personalistic way that the policy was run between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. so that there really is real anger and an appetite to do something about Saudi Arabia that's coming from Congress. And definitely we can look at that within the Democratic Congress, but I think there is even broader and to some extent, some bipartisan concern over the leadership, particularly of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and wanting to see or believe that the US should be using our relationship and our influence over Saudi Arabia to kind of set out some markers for a young leader, you know, who presumably will probably be influential in the region for a long time. And the sense that the Trump administration really didn't do that, or perhaps even did much the opposite. So because of this, then I think if we look in the region right now, we can look at Saudi Arabia. I'm sensing a little bit of incoherence in their policy right now as they try to react to these changes that are coming. We've seen them kind of reaching out in all directions. We could talk about the meeting between, well, the reported meeting between Mohammed bin Salman and Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course. We can talk about recent outreach or talk with both Turkey, now with Qatar as well, and some real moves to resolve perhaps, or at least initial steps towards easing the Gulf crisis that has been established because of the boycott over Qatar. We can see actually a hardening of stance towards political detainees through the conviction of the dual American citizen Walid Fatahi, and the transfer of some of the women activists, including the prominent case of Loujain al-Hajjul, to a special terrorism court. So as the Biden administration kind of pulls up its list of issues that it wants to deal with Saudi Arabia, we can see the kingdom sort of signaling those issues that they may be willing to sort of deal with, and other ones which they're trying to take off the table. I want to, before I end, I want to say something quickly about the United Arab Emirates as well, because I think talking about that state it's a really growing importance actor in the region, but also because it's symbolic just for a state that's really gone the farthest in reorienting itself as a national power, and one that sees its interests much more broadly than we've seen in the past. A lot of times when I talk to Emirati policymakers, they talk about the UAE as not a Gulf power, but as an Arabian Peninsula power, which I think kind of gives you the opportunity, when you think of it as a peninsula, it has interests both, you know, east, looking towards South Asia, and as well looking west towards the Horn of Africa. And we've seen the UAE intervening then in a number of different fields beyond to the Mediterranean as well. And so I think when we look at the UAE, it's done a lot of work to really establish itself as a credible partner. Indeed, one that wants to be seen as the preferred partner for a rising cast of multinational states that are looking to secure their interests and intervening in this region. In short, it's trying to make itself indispensable. And I think now then, if we look at its courting, and indeed even of Israel, so now that these relationships are quite public through the signing of the Abraham Accords, I think that can really be almost like a definitive statement of their expanded ambitions, and to underline that they see the region in a way that's not going to be beholden to past constructs. You know, Israel is very important regional power. Israel can be very helpful as competition rises, not only with Iran, but also with Turkey, and looking at European interests or interests in the Horn of Africa. Israel is a useful conduit to the United States, and it's also, I might mention, a useful hedge to Saudi Arabia. So it's really doing a lot of work. I guess I'll just end there by saying that obviously this is a period of enormous transition, not only in the United States as we shift from these different policy perspectives and positions and try to weigh our priorities, but also a big transition in the Middle East in general. So there's a lot to do in rebuilding sort of our capacity and adjusting to these new requirements of trying to do more with less. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Kristin. I see that there are questions for you already, but let's leave them for the end so you get a break. Let me turn to Benjamin Haddad, hello, who's going to tell us what he thinks about transatlantic relations in the new era. Is it going to be, back to a dreamlike Obama-style situation? That wasn't really perfect either, to be honest, but what do you think is going to happen?
Hi, Laurence, and it's great to be with all of you at IFRI and see some friends on the screen right now. So yeah, just a few words on what I think this Biden administration entails for Europe and the transatlantic relationship, both opportunities, but also challenges, and I think also risk of overpromising and maybe disappointment down the road that Europeans should be wary about. I mean, first, look, let's be clear. This is probably the most pro-Atlanticist administration since the George H.W. Bush administration, both in terms of the temperament and political cultures of the people populating it, but also as a desire to do, I would say, the reverse and the opposite of the last 4 years of the Trump administration. Biden has campaigned, his foreign policy platform put alliances at the heart of his vision. He has already announced the gathering of a summit of liberal democracies early in his term. It's a little vague what he really intends to do, what kind of democracies, what will be the agenda. Some of the people around him are talking about a sort of ambitious agenda to tackle corruption and kleptocracy, money laundering as a way to push back against authoritarians like Russia and China and their hold on our own systems. But clearly the idea of the United States leading a group of liberal democracies with the European Union at the heart of it is at the center of Joe Biden's foreign policy agenda. We'll see some decisions that clearly will go a long way also in assuaging the relationship between the United States and Europe. Really among the first few decisions of the Biden administration, one of the most symbolic ones is rejoining the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Obviously, that will be a major message sent to the European Union, a desire, I think, to reinvest in international organizations. The Biden team has already announced the decision to cancel the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, and a desire to work with Europeans on global issues, first being obviously the strategic rivalry with China. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. With that being said, I think there are three caveats I would underline in what this means for Europeans. The first one, and Walter, Steve alluded to it, is the risk of a desire to go to a restoration, sort of back to normal, to really put the Trump years behind us and consider them an aberration in American foreign policy. And thus, I think, really reinvest in a more traditional transatlantic relationship, really focused on NATO. I think the President Biden will, especially in here again, to take the counterpoint to the last 4 years, will want to focus on the relationship with Berlin and Germany. That's something that Walter said, and I think is very true. We already see this debate in a way among Europeans preparing themselves for this, with AKK, the German defense minister, going after the concept of strategic autonomy from Europeans and saying, the United States being the main security anchor, main security guarantor of European defense must stay. And so I think that's also a way for some European leaders to already start conveying messages to the United States. I think one of the risks in this obviously is a Biden administration. That's a risk, by the way, on the European side more than on the American side, would be to kill some of the little momentum we've seen in the last few years for increased European defense and Europeans stepping up on security issues. The second risk that I find connected to this first one is, and something that Steve not only mentioned, but I think embodies in his work, is the fact that there is very little political appetite right now in the United States coming from both parts of the left and the right for increased interventionism, especially in areas where I think a large part of the American polity and public opinion does not consider that direct American security interests are concerned. We've seen this obviously with both the Obama and Trump administration when it comes to Syria and the direct neighborhood of the European Union, conflicts that had, I'd say, direct security consequences for Europe from the rise of terror organizations or on world migration. I think we've seen two American administrations in a row convey to Europeans and to the world that this was just not a strategic priority for the US anymore. And it's important to remember that Joe Biden, who comes in right now with a very ambitious and internationalist message, was on the non-interventionist side of the debates within the Obama administration. It's not necessarily the case of Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, who I think tend to be more on a traditional liberal internationalist wing of the Democratic Party. But Joe Biden is someone who, as a political leader, I think was very sensitive to this trend in American public opinion, and was, I think, encouraging in this more non-interventionist approach. So I think one of the risks that we see in the next few years is unrealistic expectations created by this sort of "we're back" rhetoric from the Biden administration. And if tomorrow you have a major security crisis in the periphery of Europe, let's say in Libya or in Bosnia and elsewhere, very little appetite for intervention on the American side. And the third point I would underline is I think you still have some core disagreements, or at least issues where you don't have a clear convergence between the United States and Europe, and I would say even among Europeans, and that were not directly linked to Trump's agenda or persona, and they will linger despite, I think, a lot of the goodwill that we're seeing right now on both sides. We've seen this I think very ambitious and interesting EU document last week, the joint statement on a renewed transatlantic partnership listing from COVID to China to trade and technology issues, an ambitious agenda for transatlantic cooperation. And I see here in Washington with people around the Biden team, I think a lot of positive reception towards that document. But if you think of an issue like the relationship we want to have with Turkey, and in the East Med or in the Middle East, I think there's still a lot of debates, not only within Europeans, but also within the Biden team, where some will point, like the president-elect, by the way, will point to rising authoritarianism and the aggressive behavior of Turkey and its neighborhood. But you also have some of his advisors still seeing Turkey as a potential buffer against Russia from Libya or to Syria. So I think, especially when it comes to the Franco-American relationship, that question of Turkey might still remain a hurdle. Another hurdle is a potential hurdle, but also path for cooperation, is obviously the relationship we want to have with China. You will have I think, a Biden team that will be much more willing to work and to include Europeans in a global strategy to contain China. I think we've seen the Trump administration, President Trump himself, I would say, mostly focused on trade numbers with a very zero-sum game approach to trade that we remember from Trump, and trying to deal on this in a very bilateral way with Xi Jinping. I think clearly the Biden team will see having the European Union with its standard setting power, normative power, as a clear asset in its competition with China. I think we'll have a broader approach that will include technology, that will include economic issues and innovation, that will include human rights. Jake Sullivan, I would refer you, by the way, to I think a fascinating conversation between Walter Mead and Jake Sullivan at Hudson Institute a few months ago, where Sullivan, I think, laid out, how he sees even the role of economic issues and innovation in this strategic competition. So they will see the European Union as an asset. However, I do think that will translate in a clear desire on Europeans to pick a side, to be blunt. And if you listen to the pressure that the Trump administration had put on Europeans over the choice of telecom providers for 5G networks. I expect the Biden administration to double down on this and even maybe use the Treasury Department extraterritorial sanctions to put more pressures on Europeans in this respect. So alliances will come also with I think an expectation of Europeans being aligned to a certain extent. One last point I think that will continue to be a hurdle, although I do expect a more constructive approach on this, but the structural disagreements we've seen in the last few years were not directly here again linked to Trump, is on trade and digital issues. It's interesting to see just in the last week, the EU releasing this document calling for a new transatlantic deal, and the same week continuing to push an agenda for digital sovereignty with the release of the Digital Service Act, with obviously some capitals like Brussels and Paris pushing an agenda for taxation of big tech companies. I think on this, you will continue to find differing perspectives, and I will just remind that Kamala Harris, the vice president-elect, is the senator from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. So, I clearly also tech companies will continue to be influential in the conversation on this. Obviously, it's not even necessary to mention trade, where TTIP failed. Also, mostly I would say because of the European side and the weight also of European public opinions on some of these trade issues. So, I think I would expect the U.S. to try to be more constructive on these conversations, to not let these differences escalate in the way that we've seen them in the last few years, and obviously not politicize them with the threat of tariffs like we had seen done with the Trump administration. I think on the question of taxation, for example, of tech companies, the US would be more willing to come back to the OECD and the negotiation table. But that doesn't mean that these differences will be just magically put behind us and they will linger. So I think clearly, I don't want to be pessimistic. I think there's a real window of opportunity for transatlantic cooperation and on a lot of global issues, but I think we need to be realistic about what we expect, and especially I think it's important for Europeans not to give up ambitions and an agenda of being a global actor themselves.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, that was very interesting as well, and the issues of 5G and taxation of the GAFAs are, of course, going to continue to be problematic at least. And may I take a minute here to tell everyone that IFRI recently launched a new research program on the geopolitics of technologies, headed by Alice Panier, who used to be in DC for a few years, right? And so she's back home, she's at IFRI, and she's launching this program that will look at all these issues. Many questions on Turkey, I see, many questions on 5G as well, but I want to turn to Alex, who's been sitting silently ever since we started this session, and this cannot go on much longer. So Alex, you're going to tell us about US-China prospects. I'm sure you're going to mention 5G as well, so please.
I am, thank you, Laurence. Laurence knows me well enough to make fun of me because we were colleagues about 20 years ago in Washington, and neither of us probably wanted me to say the length of time that's been. But I do want to thank both you and IFRI for hosting not only this, but the 18 versions of this conference before. As you know, this is always an anchor that I look forward to as part of a trip annually that I make to Europe, and I hope to do it in the future soon. In the meantime, I do think professionally that we've all lost a great asset in being able to travel to each other's country and have private conversations to really better understand some of the massive changes going on, whether it's to Paris or China or India or Germany, London, or any other part of the world. And so I want to try and make these relatively brief to get to conversations to try and engage the audience as well, rather than just have this being a proverbial dog and pony show. So what the basic point that I want to make on strategy toward China is that unlike most of the Biden administration, where it is geared to try and be ready on day one to implement its preconceived strategy, the version of the Biden administration, or the method of the Biden administration in the first 2 years, I suspect, will be to devise a China strategy. They do not yet have one. And that is not unique to the Biden administration. But the fact is that there is a deceptive consensus that the United States has on China, because that consensus is simply that what we have done toward China for the last generation has not worked. That the strategy of engagement in trying to change China and change its behavior has fundamentally failed. And that's something that we saw pivot around 2015 or so, just at the end of the Obama administration, as Xi Jinping was coming into office, before he extended his tenure so that he could serve as the head of the Chinese government for more than 10 years. And there really has yet to be anything to replace that strategy, other than a consensus that when the Trump administration designed the national security strategy around great power competition toward China and Russia, is that that was one of the few areas that really had bipartisan agreement across the United States political spectrum, particularly of foreign policy experts. And yet what it does not say is what happens next. What do we do instead of that strategy of, call it engagement and enlargement, call it trying to make China a responsible stakeholder, whatever the different versions of strategy over the post-Cold War 30 years haven't worked, and we need to do something else. And that's where the consensus breaks down in the United States right now, and where we have an ongoing debate that I think the Biden administration will look going forward. I'm not going to do this for many of the points that I want to make, but when you read articles that we publish in the Washington Quarterly at least 3 times before they come out, a couple of key threads or statements really jump out at you that I wanted to relay to support this argument. Ali Wine, who's a great rising thinker who used to be at RAND and is now at the Atlantic Council, is working on a book on great power competition. And in his spring 2020 article on how to think about decoupling from China, this simple thread that getting tough on China is emotionally satisfying, yet strategically inadequate. It is an attitude, not a strategy, that the United States has had toward China under the Trump administration, and frankly, much more broadly. And about a year prior to that, Evan Medeiros, who was the senior director at the National Security Council under Obama from Asia, in an article called The Changing Fundamentals of US-China Relations, wrote that competition is more of a condition than a strategy. It is not enough for policymakers to call for more competition with China. The debate needs to be with what tools, on what issues, at what costs. And we have yet to have that debate in the United States or elsewhere. What I see the Biden administration doing in the first year, in addition to prioritizing things like distributing vaccines, economic relief from the pandemic, elevating climate change as an important issue, ending forever wars, or moving in that direction in places like Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq, as others have talked about, is certainly toward China. But I would say Biden is going to look to do 3 things to establish an architecture to develop on a strategy on China. And that is, first, depolarize the strategic environment around policymaking toward China, so depolarizing. Second is demilitarize the approach to China. And third is multilateralize the approach to China. And if he's able to do those 3 things in the first year, I think he will have made a great accomplishment with his administration to set the groundwork to really develop a multilaterally sustainable strategy on how to manage the China challenge, or as Walter said earlier, to try and manage the rise of China within a larger architecture. So the first point is depolarizing. The fundamental tension that the Biden administration is going to face is, how do you elevate climate change and cooperation on climate change with China without looking weak on China and setting off a firestorm of domestic criticism that they are not being tough enough on China and that they're being panda hunters. If you are going to elevate climate change and pandemics as a strategic priority of the administration, those are not necessarily areas that are going to look like you are being tough on China. Now, the reality is, I think all of us as strategic thinkers need to separate the idea of cooperation or confrontation from friendship or adversarial relationships. As someone who's been a youth sports coach at a very high level for years, I can tell you this: we cooperate with friends all the time. That is not something I need to tell a French audience as an American. It is not the case that you need to be friendly in order to cooperate, nor is it the case that you need to be adversaries in order to compete. And the idea of depolarizing or disconnecting that approach of whether and on what issues you cooperate or confront a country, and whether you are friendly, like-minded, or adversarial with them, are completely distinct. You may get at the margin greater cooperation with a friendly country, but it is marginal. It is not fundamental. And we need to try and shape the political environment as strategic thinkers and as analysts to disconnect that association of cooperation from friendship and confrontation from adversarial relations. We do both with both sets of countries all the time, and we need to be more explicit and public about that. Second, demilitarize the relationship with China. One of the overlooked aspects of the early Obama administration, late first term Obama administration, to pivot toward Asia was not about the regional pivot toward Asia, be it away from the Middle East or anywhere else. It was also about pivoting away from defining the United States as only a military guarantor of security to also be an economic engine that worked with the region. And the linchpin to that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's been undercut. So what Biden's going to have to do is sort of three aspects to try and demilitarize the relationship. Within demilitarizing, first, how do you undo a trade war? There was an article that was written based on an interview that the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman had with Biden that was published last Wednesday on December 2nd. That's worth taking a look at, because one of the things that Biden specifically said in that article is that he would not act immediately to remove the 25% tariffs that Trump has imposed, nor to undo the phase one agreement. He's going to enter into office and have that be part of a traditional strategic review or policy review on policy toward China. Now, I suspect that this might be more of a diplomatic move, that he's simply not just going to give away the tariff removal for free and will look to extract concessions from China to do so. But there is going to be a question about how you look tough on China if you are removing tariffs on China and looking to work with China on pandemics, vaccine distribution, and climate change. It will be very hard politically to do both. So how do you undo that trade war? Because the tariffs are backfiring. And that is an economic argument that I don't need to go into, and others can testify to much more than I can. Second, Taiwan and Hong Kong are going to be more problematic, not less. If the identity of the administration, as Walter and others have said, is about elevating human rights and democracy in ways that Trump clearly didn't prioritize, that is the linchpin to the conflicting identities about China and the one China policy, where Taiwan and Hong Kong are part of China, and the democratic survival of Taiwan and Hong Kong or transition into a one China state. It will be more likely that Taiwan and Hong Kong will drag the United States in a Biden administration into a confrontational relationship going forward. And we've already seen some of this in the proposal by Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, to clarify strategic ambiguity with Taiwan. That is a precursor of what we may see going forward that will make it difficult to demilitarize that relationship. And third, under demilitarization, can the CPTPP, it's not the Trump Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what may be known as the TPP-11, or the agreement by the surviving 11 states of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and whether the United States can re-enter into that, whether China seeks to re-enter that, and whether that can still be a revived anchor for a demilitarized approach of the United States toward China, because China fundamentally sees the competition in economic terms, as I think this administration, particularly Sullivan and Blinken and others do as well. And if the CPTPP is not that anchor, what else is? Because that was the linchpin to demilitarizing the approach at the end of the last administration. So depolarizing and demilitarizing are the first quests for the first year of the Biden administration. The third is to multilateralize it. And here I would say, be wary of the bells and whistles of the Summit for Democracy. And I say that intentionally because, for starters, recognize it is a summit for democracy, which might get the Biden administration out of some of the concerns that Benjamin raised about the participation in such a major multilateral conference that Biden has said in a foreign affairs article he wants to host in a first year of his administration. I would view the Biden administration's efforts as more of sort of a Russian Matryoshka doll of 5 different levels of multilateralism that he will seek to enter at different phases depending on who can get things done. At the largest level, you're going to see universal multilateral agreements, re-entering the Paris Accord, the WHO, as Benjamin and others have said. That's the big eye-catching architecture, as is the second, which is this Summit for Democracies that he wants to hold. The third is that even within the Biden administration, I expect there is some debate about having something that you might think of as more of a Security Council of democracies. But instead of 5 states, it's 10, which is a linkage that Boris Johnson has already proposed of the 7 original members of the G7 with India and Australia, the other members of the Quad, and possibly South Korea, as the 10 major democracies globally that can look to construct a coalition of heavy economic weight, heavy global political influence, and yet small enough to get things done within the larger architecture of a summit of democracy or a universalist multilateral efforts like the Paris Accord or the WHO. And then underneath what I think might be that active third tier, or something of a D10, which draws on the lessons of the end of the Obama administration of so-called effective multilateralism. And here, unlike Walter, I would say this is more of what I think is comfortable for a French audience than a German audience, that multilateralism isn't necessarily universal, but it is a core set of actors that can get things done that at that level of those 10 countries might be the locus of real activity in some mini-lateral coalitions that are on issue-specific areas. While underneath that, you have regional efforts like the Quad in Asia and bilateral consultations that we're more familiar with. At the end of the day, what that means is that the effort to depolarize, demilitarize, and multilateralize the approach to China in the first term would set up the ability to develop a strategy. Because the other thing in that Friedman article from last Wednesday that I mentioned, that the article concludes, is that, quote, Biden first wants to conduct a full review of the existing agreement with China, the phase 1 agreement, and consult with our traditional allies in Asia and Europe, he said, so we can develop a coherent strategy. Because the fact is, there is no coherent strategy to replace the consensus that the previous one has failed. So look for it to be developed early in the Biden administration. And with that, I'll turn it over and look forward to the discussion in the time that's remaining.
Thank you, Alex. That was very dense indeed. It sounded very French because it was a 3-part, 3 under chapter presentation. It's what we do in French university. I remember when I was a student in England years ago, being given a correction to my paper that had 7, and the correction by the professor had 7 parts. And I just couldn't get my mind around that. But anyway, thank you very much. We turn to questions, and there's many of them. I don't know where to start. I will start with the first one that is addressed to Professor Mead, and it regards nuclear negotiations. Do you think, says the question by, let me see, who asked the question? It's Annick Cizel from University Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. She wants to know whether going forward, the nuclear negotiations, that the new start that the Biden administration has said they would try and revive with Russia, may be extended to China in a sort of triangle, or in a sort of new strategic triangle going forward. Do you think that's that is likely or not?
I don't see a lot of sign that China is interested in that, and really you can't have talks with people who don't want to have talks. But realistically, whether China is in the room or not, both Russia and the United States would shape their offers and their positions in that kind of negotiation, taking China's growing arsenal into account. So I think we're going to see China as a weight in those negotiations, but I don't think it's ready yet to become a participant.
Thank you. Anyone wants to comment on that, or do we move to the next question?
Yeah, Laurence, if I can just add on to that.
Please.
I think Walter's right. I think what at least I and other nuclear analysts think, it's very hard to replicate the arms control environment that we're used to with the former Soviet Union, given how many other countries, particularly in that Asian chain, going from the US, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, where the shape of one affects the other, and it's very hard to get an agreement among all of them simultaneously. So that traditional role of arms control in the non-proliferation regime is reduced given the number of other countries in the last 20 years that have become nuclear, and other tools may play a bigger role going forward as they have in the last few. I think the START will get renewed, but beyond that, new agreements will be hard to reach.
Thank you. There is a question that that is about Turkey and Turkey's activism in the East Mediterranean. Both Kristin and Benjamin mentioned it earlier. What do you think may be the Biden administration take on this? What will they try to do? Maybe Kristin, you can start.
Sorry, I was muted. It might actually be helpful to have Benjamin start first, because I think this gets tied in with a lot of the European relations and their competing kind of approaches towards Turkey. And then I can add something about from the Middle East perspective.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think right now Turkey is a really embarrassing issue for a lot of American policymakers. It's a member of NATO. It's a historic ally of the United States for a long time. A lot of American strategists relied on Turkey as a partner, especially to contain Russia. And you still hear and see this perspective expressed when it comes to looking at Syria or even at Libya for some. I think if you hear the way the French see it, on the contrary, they see right now Ankara and Moscow basically sharing the spoils of American withdrawal from a lot of these regions. And the agreement at the end of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I think, confirmed the way a lot of French strategists or even European strategists look at this issue. This was a conflict that ended up being in the interest of both actors, and I would say at the expense of local actors that saw Azerbaijan, especially Armenia, that saw a lot of their margins of maneuvers reduced by these two powers. So I think there's still a lot of debates and no clear view right now within the Biden team on how they decide to approach this. If you look at the statements from the candidate Biden during the campaign, they were very tough on Turkey. They were very tough on Turkey's authoritarian trends, and there were a few statements from Biden. He even asked for the decision on Hagia Sophia to be overturned. When it comes to the East Med, he also made some pretty strong statements reaffirming American commitment to the maritime sovereignty of Greece and Cyprus. Same things, also pretty strong statements of support for Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, these are campaign statements. You have strong Greek and Armenian constituencies in the United States. How will that translate into foreign policy? I think that's a different matter. What's interesting, though, when we talk about the Eastern Mediterranean is that you have seen a trend also among American policymakers for a progressive shift of alliance of the United States. One of the most eloquent statement of this is the East Med Act that was voted by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last year, bipartisan statement from Menendez on the Democratic side and Marco Rubio on the Republican side, saying that the U.S. should get much closer to Greece, Cyprus, and Israel in their energy conflict with Turkey in the region. So you do have this trend right now, including in the Democratic Party, and Erdogan's behavior has only reinforced this. The S-400 purchase, obviously, and a lot of things we've seen in the last few years. But I don't think it's a debate that's really solved right now. I think there's still the hope among many to salvage the relationship in a way or another with Turkey, to also think that Turkey is not only, that's something I've heard in some conversation, Turkey cannot be summed up by Erdogan. We can't insult the future. We have to find a way to continue to work with Turkey. So that I think might be, especially with Paris and Athens, a difficult issue in the next months and years.
Thank you, Benjamin. Kristin, what do you say?
I could just add that, I mean, Turkey is obviously an actor that has really divided the Middle East actors. We can even see it at the heart of the division amongst the Gulf states themselves, as you know, we had Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt and the other Quartet countries moving against Qatar. Then, of course, we saw Qatar moving to Turkey to kind of find support there. And we've seen kind of this Turkish and Emirati competition play out. You could throw Saudi Arabia in there too, across the Horn of Africa and into Libya and the Mediterranean as well. And I think, like I mentioned, I think even some of the reach out to Israel is, usually it's described as an alliance against Iran, which it is that, but it's definitely also been looking towards Turkey as kind of a regional threat. And those are both on a geostrategic basis, but also in an ideational way. As you know, we've seen kind of this intra-Sunni conflict and concern who's going to have leadership over that posture. So I think it will be interesting to see if under a Biden administration there will be some opportunity for, you mentioned depolarization, I think, in that context. So, when we're looking at the initial signs of perhaps some warming of the intra-Gulf conflict between Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia at least making some initial outreach to Turkey. I guess there's at least the potential to sort of see some mediation on the Middle East side, although I think that competition and the ideational component is still very strong.
Thank you. Let's remain in the Middle East for another question. James, I believe maybe it's James Castello, whom I know, who wonders whether Iran could turn to China for support, if it's not maybe the case already. Who knows anything about this and may answer?
I mean, I think I'll just start and then we can move on to maybe Alexander wants to jump in on that. But there's been no question. I mean, the Trump administration, as they've kind of focused as a laser on cutting back any source of revenue for Iran. Iran has tried to look to other directions, to Iran and Russia predominantly too. But I think for Iran, they did find to some degree huge limitations in that with the ability that the United States was able to kind of cut off their resources. So that does make me think that Iran will probably, and it depends on how this is framed, will want to be perhaps looking to at least make some kind of adjustment with the United States to allow itself greater space than, because right now I think that ability to interact with those countries is limited because of the economic sanctions.
Alex, you want to jump in?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is, the question is, how far would China want to get involved? I mean, they certainly have enough going on in their world between a border conflict with India, issues with Taiwan and Hong Kong, the tension on Xinjiang and what they're doing there, and their own economic issues, that it would be hard or difficult unless they were really interested in just sticking their finger in the eye of the United States every turn they could. And that would not be a smart strategy on their part. I certainly see it as a reason or place Iran would want to turn. And it obviously depends on specific things you could do. So it'd be very narrow or marginal, but I don't see China believing it would be in their interest to be supportive of developing an Iranian nuclear program for any number of reasons. Early with the new administration, that probably would be better suited for them than the Trump administration was. I mean, I don't know why they would make it even more difficult for themselves, particularly from Beijing's case or point of view.
Thank you. Stephen, you haven't commented on any of the question, but I'm sure you have points you may want to come back to.
Well, perhaps this is an opportunity for me to express some surprise that a great power competition, which emerged as the framework of the Trump administration's Pentagon, has gone unremarked by us entirely, and relates somewhat to the question about whether you know, a China-Iran partnership could develop over the next 4 years. And I think we haven't mentioned it actually for good reason. We're not necessarily wrong. It's perhaps proving to be less powerful of a construct than one might have assumed a couple years ago from the way in which it seemed to be inspiring bipartisan support. And it does raise the question. I mean, one of the problems with that construct is the way in which it lumps Russia and China together, and therefore suggests a kind of equation for the United States of those two challenges, of which China is clearly the more formidable one. And then if taken, you know, to its logical conclusion, you might say would suggest hardening competition or adversarial gestures toward both powers that might tend to drive those powers together. So I'm rather interested in whether the Biden administration will retain great power competition or just the Pentagon early on, or whether we'll see some new approach. But what that would be, I think, as a sort of top line matter remains rather unclear.
Okay, anyone wants to comment on Stephen's comments? Okay, just counted to 5 in my head. And so we move to the next question, which is North Korea. We haven't mentioned Trump's failed attempts to, spectacular but failed attempts to engage North Korea and to get them to negotiate anything. I am not sure I've read what the Biden campaign proposed to do on that, but they certainly have a plan, I would hope. Maybe, Walter, you want to start on this issue?
Well, I actually don't think there's much anybody can do about North Korea. They're not going to stop building bombs, and we're not going to start a war with them. That, you know, those two poles define what's possible there. And, you know, that has bad corrosive effects throughout the region. And North Korea is likely to, you know, continue to push the limits here. I wouldn't say Trump's, well, I would say every American president since Clinton has failed in North Korea policy. If you describe failure, if you describe success as stopping North Korea developing the bomb and making that bomb more useful and more available. So I think our unbroken string of North Korea policy failure is likely to continue into the Biden administration. To some degree, the problem with North Korea has morphed into one of, you know, it's sort of this very ugly mess, and you need to find a box to put it in. And because the mess keeps growing, every now and then you need a bigger box. To some degree, that's what Trump did. You know, we have this friendship and so on. On the good news, the North Korean nuclear bomb stopped being such a, you know, destabilizing force. There was a sense of, well, okay, maybe it's theatrical, but something is going on. And Biden will have to find a something. Again, it's an interesting issue because in some ways the net effect of the North Korean nuclear program is to hasten the day when Japan goes nuclear, and presumably also Taiwan goes nuclear. which 2 days I think would not be far apart if they started to happen. And you know, that has always been an element of common interest between the United States and China that made the situation in Asia a little bit more interesting and complicated, that neither the United States nor China really wanted to see nuclear proliferation in East Asia, albeit for very different reasons. Trump, I think, may have secretly not thought that was such a terrible idea. If Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan all went nuclear, the United States could stop trying to be the policeman of Asia, because our policeman of Asia role is connected to this non-proliferation. But that is you know, for the Biden administration, that's a much more complicated and unsavory spectacle, because for them, non-proliferation is a fundamental element of the values-based world order that they would like to build. And while for a realist, you know, hey, let everyone have nukes, and then the one thing we'll know is there'll never be a nuclear war. That is a theoretical proposition that a lot of political scientists believe in. It's harder for a statesman to bet the ranch on that. But even more, if you are a believer in liberal order, the nuclear bomb is Westphalia in the flesh. That is to say, a state that has nuclear weapons is exempt from the coercive power of liberal order to a very large degree. And then if we also add that with nuclear weapons proliferation, that is no longer maybe going to be the only or the chief or even the most fearful form of weapons proliferation in an era of engineered viruses and cyber attacks and who knows what. And by viruses, I don't mean computer viruses, I mean human biological viruses. You know, the unresolved problem of North Korea is this problem that we don't have a way of controlling it. It asks fundamental questions about the nature of the world that we live in, and it basically opens the door to a lot of very ugly things. If I had the answer to this problem, I wouldn't be speaking with you this morning. I would probably be sitting with Tony Blinken and a few other people, you know, explaining things to them, and they would be very grateful for it. But that is, you know, it is a real question. It is an unanswered and maybe an unanswerable one.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to comment on?
Yeah, just three very brief points, because I gathered Stephen does also. One is, you know, the beauty of the so-called strategic patience approach that the Obama administration pursued, which I don't disagree with Walter at all. It was also a failure, and a spectacular failure in some ways, is that it put a very smart strategic brand on the reality that there are no good policy options. It was basically sanction and wait and hope things change, because we don't know what to do otherwise. And although that failed in the goal of non-proliferation, it also managed to sort of sideline the problem in ways that made it look like we were doing something, and kind of wait out what what happens next. It had consequences, but that was the best of a bad set of options. Second, North Korea is now a deterrence problem, not a non-proliferation problem, to be realistic. 14 years ago, I was telling authors that wrote about this to stop calling North Korea an aspiring nuclear state, because they had tested nuclear weapons and it was time to adjust to a reality. I do think that we are in a mindset now that there are 9, with Iran being the sole remaining question of the old rogue state non-proliferation mindset. But as Walter said, a lot of the nuclear challenges are now about security assurances and about Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, rather than rogue states, because most of them have either gone nuclear, collapsed as a state, or Iran is the one remaining question of the traditional non-proliferation agenda as we thought about it 20 years ago. But Dave Kang, who's an Asian scholar, and others will tell you, we have to think about, in the Pentagon corridors, about North Korea as a deterrence problem rather than non-proliferation problem, even though politically it's impossible to say that out loud, because we would be giving up on the goal of making them non-nuclear, and that's politically inconceivable. And then I'll leave it at that for those 2 points going forward. Oh, I'm sorry, let me just say one quick thing. The third is, the key in the first year is not what the United States does, is what does North Korea do? There are already others that are starting to say, will Kim Jong-un try and attract attention? Because ultimately this is a sanctions release game in the same way that the Iran challenge is, even though those two countries have different reasons that they're looking to remove sanctions. But if North Korea is going to be on the agenda of a very full Biden first year, it's going to be because Kim Jong-un puts them there with missile tests, not because Biden does anything with the range of other problems he has on his plate.
Okay, Stephen, you wanted to say something, I think?
Yeah, I think the North Korea issue is one that will provide something of a test as to whether the United States can act strategically and creatively or not. We've now seen the failure of attempts to prevent the nuclearization of North Korea under all types of administrations. And I certainly agree. The question is now one of deterrence. But President Trump did one thing I think really right, along with a lot of things that were not, and valuable if the Biden administration wants to pick up on it. And that was with a classic combination of, kind of absurdity and a certain amount of perspicacity. Trump went to meet with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, and then got on his plane and tweeted that the threat from North Korea was over. Okay, absurd. If the threat was a real one before, it was still a real one then. However, this is quite interesting. I did not get any more calls from family members asking me whether they should live in fear that North Korea was going to send a nuclear missile into the United States. He suggested that, in effect, the United States could live with a nuclear North Korea, and that this was not a fundamental problem for the United States. Now, the course of diplomacy was lamentable from that point on. So, if the Biden administration wants to take that grain of wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, and build on it, it would entail, I think, the practice of diplomacy to reduce tension in the Korean Peninsula between the North and South, and very much follow the lead that South Korea has wanted to go in over the past several years, and then try to manage this problem and indeed treat it as a manageable one for the United States and the region, instead of continuing on a course that clearly hasn't worked for a long time of trying to pursue complete denuclearization on the peninsula, which means a kind of perpetual state of enmity and sanctions, and trying to outcast North Korea without a conceivable end.
So, in other words, let's stop focusing on the threat from North Korea and assume it's not such a big deal, and it will make it so in the end. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Well, yeah, time will tell. Yeah.
More or less. I mean, active efforts have to be made, but it would involve both deterrence and a measure of reducing the long-term enmity that North Korea feels toward others in the region, including South Korea, et cetera, and vice versa.
Right. Unless one of you has something to say on that issue. No. Let me turn to maybe what will be the last issue in the Q&A. It's about Russia. Michel Baczynski wonders whether the Biden administration may be interested to open a negotiation at NATO level with Russia to address several issues, probably Ukraine, maybe human rights, who knows, cyber attacks, or more military NATO-related problems. Maybe Benjamin could have a go? Sorry.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I do think there will be a willingness within the Biden team to work on issues like arms control with Russia, for sure. That being said, I think also for domestic political reasons and where Russia has really become almost of a boogeyman for Democrats since 2016, the hacking in the election, and because of shifting priorities, I think there'll be very little appetite to work with Russia, especially at a high political level. I mean, I wouldn't expect a Biden-Putin meeting in the next 4 years. I just don't think I don't see what would be gained politically and strategically from this. Some of our other panelists might disagree. And I would add that my sense is that one of the ways in which the Biden administration will try to address Russia will be by stepping up and modernizing the sanctions infrastructure and using, it's important because I think that's a little lost in Europe, where the conversation between economic issues and national security issues is not as integrated as it is right now in the US. One of the themes that's the most popular among part of the Democratic Party apparatus right now is the question of kleptocracy and corruption. And so it's mostly about addressing Russian dirty money and money laundering in European capitals, in the United States, pushing back this way. And so using these levers as a national security tool. I think you'll see the Biden administration do this, push global Magnitsky, for example, a lot in the next few years. And so that would be, I think, the approach I'll expect the most when it comes to the relationship with Russia.
Thank you.
And I would add, sorry, because there's been a little debate also during the campaign over the question of a new reset with Russia, and clearly the people right now that you see around Joe Biden and Joe Biden himself, I think, do not at all fall on the side of this new reset.
Okay. Anyone on this Russia issue?
I guess, sorry, I'll just add very quickly. I think Benjamin's right. If you look at the debate about Russia ahead of time, I think the threat perception was very much that they were playing a different game in interfering in our internal politics very much, not a traditional role. I think they certainly have a spoiler role in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular, that could be problematic going forward. But if the big concern was that they were either had compromise on Trump or that they were going to interfere in the elections, that doesn't seem to have happened this time around. And so if the sense is that at least in direct election interference is our defenses worked, unless there's something that comes out about how they're directly interfering in social media campaigns to enhance the domestic instability, I think Russia's going to go away unless they put them there. Not that they're actually going to go away, but the attention to them is going to be much less than it was in the last administration.
Yeah, it's very true that we were expecting a lot of Russian interference in the campaign, and nothing really emerged, apparently. So, I mean, as far as we know today.
And that was one of the big things about Krebs being fired, was that it was basically that his efforts had worked, is that it had kept the Russians outside if they were trying to do things. Now, I don't know if that's true to a great extent, but the perception is that it has.
I find myself with one last question that just popped into my mind. I had forgotten to ask it before. Unless Kristin or Walter or Stephen want to comment on the Russia situation, I will ask my last question.
Well, I'll just say just really quickly that Russia is going to be an ongoing actor in the Middle East. It's definitely, since its entry in Syria, is playing a more prominent role. And all of the different regional actors have been upping their mediation and partnerships and discussions with Russia, both on the political, strategic, and economic level. And also, it just should be mentioned, of course, that Russia has been taking on a larger role within oil markets and oil market negotiations too, with OPEC opening up to the OPEC Plus, in fact, just to take Russia into its considerations. So just wanted to mention that.
Okay. So my last question is about the Biden team. During the campaign, the left of the Democratic Party was very vocal, with people like Matt Duss, who's Bernie Sanders' advisor on foreign affairs. Yet the slew of nominations that we've seen these past weeks of the next administration with regard to foreign policies doesn't seem to have any of that leftist crowd in them. It's all old hands from the Obama administration, maybe sometimes the Clinton administration, that have come back to be nominated at foreign policy related posts in the coming administration. Do you concur with that? Has nobody from the leftist, quote unquote, Sanders or Warren team made the cut into the Biden administration? I don't know which of you may be in a position to answer that.
Well, sir, I think it's fair to say that I think that, again, Biden has a very strong views about foreign policy. That is, he sees that as a core competence and area of expertise. And so, as far as one can tell, they seem to be trying to cede ground on rhetoric and to cede in order to maintain a free hand, as much of a free hand as they can in foreign policy. And the other thing is, I'm not sure that they electorally feel that vulnerable to the left at the moment, that there may be a bit of a feeling that Sanders did not do as well in the primaries this time as he did in 2016. The very, very strong backing that the president-elect had from African-American voters is interesting. And finally, by focusing on climate change, and I think this should not be underestimated in the foreign policy, they feel that this both gives their foreign policy a bit of a leftist luster, while without getting in the way of what they see as their core objectives, of which climate change is one. But it also, to some degree, splits off the climate left from other parts of the progressive coalition. And I think they think that this is a strategy that can work at home and abroad, and they look to me like they're happy with it and are sticking with it, at least for now.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Laurence, I would say two quick things. One is the fact that the Senate looks like it will likely be Republican, or at least that Biden didn't wait to find out if it wasn't, gave him a little bit of an argument that he couldn't get some people through in confirmation, whether he wanted to or not. It gave him a bit of a political shield. I think that probably jeopardized, or at least the speculation has been, someone like Samantha Power or Susan Rice, who of course has now been appointed to a domestic policy position to get her advice inside the White House anyway. And the second thing is, Matt is a particularly vocal, like I was trying to think who the other people on that list might be. And other than Matt, I don't know who it would be. I mean, the progressive focus is not on foreign policy issues necessarily. There's certainly a human rights niche, but that's not where what I would consider the progressive US center has been. It's on issues like climate change, on issues like domestic equality. It's on other areas where you're seeing some potential congressional backlash, like Tiranandan for the Office of Management and Budget position, who heads up the progressive think tank CAP. So he's been able to avoid some of the potential political controversy, but I don't know who the roster of people that might have fit that description other than Matt would be on the foreign policy front necessarily. I don't know if Stephen has ideas for who I'm forgetting, but.
No, I think the point is fundamentally correct. It's been entirely unsurprising, the basic nature of the picks that that Biden has made so far. We've only seen a small number of principles, and actually in the scheme of things, the National Security Advisor designate Jake Sullivan is someone who has engaged with progressives on foreign policy issues, especially around trade, but also on military intervention in the Middle East, which he has written about over the past 4 years. So, you know, in the scheme of things, these picks, I don't think, suggest anything particularly surprising. And I think it will be, you know, the policymakers who are a little bit younger and have a different outlook and haven't grown up with the Cold War, and for whom President Trump doesn't look like an aberration in a long line of presidents who they've seen, but rather a quite potential future for the American political system, who may be pushing bolder priorities on the principles rather than the other way around. I also think, just to take a step back, the dynamics between the left and the center of the party, I think, are going to be a bit different on foreign policy than they were under the Obama administration. When Barack Obama, I think, won his primary, became the nominee, an unlikely nominee, in 2008, in large part because of his opposition to the Iraq War at the time. And he was, I think, seen by many as maybe the most progressive option or most restrained foreign policy president that could be in that particular circumstance. I think things have shifted considerably for many progressives, as well as some conservatives and people in the center or independents. And so I would expect a kind of more fulsome debate intra-party over the next 4 years, in which the Biden administration has to act like something like a broker, which didn't really happen under Obama.
I can add two quick points to that. First, on what Steve just said about the generational shift, I find this really striking, and you see this also on European and transatlantic issues. You know, it's actually even more important sometimes that the differences between the progressive or the centrist wing. There's a younger generation on European issues, for example, anecdotally, who, you know, they didn't grow up with the triumphant 90s, but their anchor is the Iraq War. And you see this either with the Biden camp or with the Sanders and Warren camp, people who are much more open to the idea of European strategic autonomy, of European defense, and much less marked by the, you know, traditional NATO school of transatlantic relations. So that I think is really interesting. The second point on domestic politics, I think it's really important, and some others have mentioned it, to understand the domestic constraints that the Biden administration is going to have. At best, we'll see a 50-50 situation in the Senate. Of course, Kamala Harris will be the tiebreaker, but that does mean that Joe Biden's task will be immense. So he'll have to constantly negotiate between getting at least 1 or 2 Republicans to be able to pass bills. And there aren't that many moderate Republicans who want to work on the bipartisan fashion left, but also take into account the left wing of the party with, you know, people like Elizabeth Warren is going to be very powerful in the Senate. You obviously have the AOC wing that's very vocal at the House of Representatives. So it'll be a constant, I think, bargaining and balancing situation for Biden that, you know, some in the French left will remember les frondeurs at the National Assembly a few years ago. And I think you might see this in the next few years.
Okay. Anyone wants to jump in? If not, well, I mean, thank you so much for participating. This has been very intense and extremely interesting. My research assistant, Mathilde, was live tweeting while we were speaking. I was not doing it myself. I was completely focused on what you were saying. So this whole conference will be online as soon as we can download it from the cloud or whatever it is they do in the IT service at IFRI. I will send you the link and everybody can listen to you again and take notes. Again, thank you. I took more than 2 hours of your morning and I'm very, very grateful. We need that sort of input from the US here in Europe.